Donald Trump's proposals to expand America's borders may seem outrageous at first glance. Buying Greenland, reclaiming the Panama Canal, and even suggesting Canada become the 51st state. But if you take a closer look at Trump's background, his business mindset, and his America First philosophy, these ideas start to make a lot more sense. Trump's approach to politics has always been unconventional, shaped by his experiences in the business world, his belief in America's global dominance, and his willingness to challenge the status quo. Before he became one of the most polarizing figures in modern politics, Trump was best known as a real estate mogul and media personality. Born in Queens, New York in 1946, he grew up in a wealthy family. His father, Fred Trump, built a fortune in real estate development, focusing on affordable housing in New York's outer boroughs. Trump inherited his father's business acumen and ambition, but took a different approach. He focused on high-profile projects, skyscrapers, luxury hotels, and even casinos, all branded with the Trump name. He wasn't just a businessman, he was a brand. Everything he touched had to be big, bold, and flashy. But Trump's business career wasn't without controversy. While he built an empire, he also faced multiple bankruptcies, legal battles, and accusations of reckless decision-making. Still, Trump always found a way to stay in the spotlight. He mastered the art of capturing attention, whether through business deals, headlines, or his role as the host of The Apprentice. His ability to control the narrative and sell himself as a successful dealmaker became one of his greatest strengths, and he took that same strategy with him when he entered politics. When Trump launched his presidential campaign in 2015, he wasn't just running as a politician, he was running as a businessman who promised to bring the same deal-making prowess to the White House. His campaign was built on one simple message: America First. It wasn't just a slogan, it was a philosophy. Trump believed that America had been taken advantage of for too long, by foreign countries, by unfair trade deals, and even by its own allies. His goal was to reverse that trend by putting American interests first, no matter the cost. At the core of his America First philosophy is a belief in national sovereignty and economic leverage. Trump sees the U.S. as a business, a powerful entity that should negotiate from a position of strength. For him, borders aren't just geographical lines, they're strategic assets. And if a piece of land has value, whether it's for military defense, natural resources, or economic control, it should be brought under American influence. This mindset explains why Trump has floated ideas that many consider extreme, like buying Greenland or reclaiming the Panama Canal. In his eyes, these aren't outrageous ideas, they're smart deals. Let's take Greenland, for example. Trump's interest in buying Greenland didn't come out of nowhere. The U.S. has tried to buy the island before. In 1946, after World War II, the U.S. offered Denmark $100 million for Greenland. Why? Because of its strategic location in the North Atlantic. Greenland became a key part of American defense strategy during the Cold War, and it still plays a crucial role today in tracking Russian submarines and guarding against missile threats. Trump saw Greenland as a valuable asset, not just for its location, but for its untapped natural resources, especially rare earth minerals, which are critical for modern technology. Trump's rhetoric about buying Greenland wasn't just a joke or a random thought. It was part of a broader strategy to strengthen America's position in the Arctic, a region that's becoming more contested as climate change opens up new shipping routes and access to resources. Countries like Russia and China are already expanding their influence in the Arctic, and Trump didn't want the U.S. to be left behind. His logic was simple. If Greenland is valuable, why shouldn't the U.S. own it? The same mindset applies to his comments about the Panama Canal. The canal, which connects the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, has been one of the most important trade routes in the world since it was built by the U.S. in the early 20th century. For decades, the U.S. controlled the canal, benefiting economically and strategically. But in 1977, President Jimmy Carter signed a treaty agreeing to return control of the canal to Panama by the end of 1999. The decision was controversial at the time, with many Republicans, including Ronald Reagan, arguing that giving up the canal was a mistake. Fast forward to today, and Trump's comments about taking back the canal sound eerily similar to those old Republican objections. He sees the canal as a critical asset that the U.S. should control to protect its economic interests, especially as China's influence in Panama continues to grow. And then there's Canada. Trump's suggestion that Canada could become the 51st U.S. state has been widely dismissed as absurd. But Trump's comments weren't entirely off the cuff. He's floated the idea multiple times on Truth Social, arguing that a US-Canada merger would improve security and boost economic stability. While the idea of annexing Canada is politically unfeasible and would be rejected by both Canadians and Americans, it reflects Trump's broader belief that borders are negotiable, and if a deal makes sense, it's worth pursuing. At the core of all these proposals is Trump's belief in transactional diplomacy. His approach to foreign policy mirrors his approach to business deals. He starts with extreme demands, knowing they'll grab attention and give him leverage at the negotiating table. We've seen this strategy play out time and again during his presidency. He threatened fire and fury against North Korea, only to become the first U.S. president to meet with a North Korean leader. He imposed tariffs on China, then negotiated a new trade deal. He withdrew from international agreements like the Paris Climate Accord and the Iran nuclear deal, claiming they were bad deals for America. Trump's territorial proposals follow the same pattern. By floating ideas like annexing Greenland or reclaiming the Panama Canal, he's testing the waters, seeing how far he can push before negotiating a compromise. But there's a key difference between real estate deals and international diplomacy. Countries aren't commodities. Sovereignty isn't something that can be bought and sold. And Trump's transactional approach to global politics often clashes with the norms of modern diplomacy, creating tension with U.S. allies and uncertainty on the world stage. So, is Trump serious about these proposals? Based on his track record, it's hard to say he isn't. Many of his early campaign promises, like renegotiating NAFTA, moving the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, and imposing tariffs on China, were dismissed as unrealistic at the time, but he followed through on them. The same could be true for his territorial ambitions. While these proposals may seem outlandish, they fit neatly into Trump's America First agenda. Whether or not he acts on them remains to be seen, but one thing is certain. His rhetoric is already reshaping how America's allies and rivals view U.S. foreign policy. Now that we've looked at Trump's background and the mindset behind his expansionist ideas, let's dive into the specifics. His proposals to buy Greenland, reclaim the Panama Canal, and even annex Canada
because it's the outsiders who change the world and who make a real and lasting difference.
What makes these territories so valuable to Trump?
Worth doing
and why are these ideas causing such a stir among world leaders? Let's start with Greenland, the icy island that's captured Trump's attention, and for good reason. Greenland isn't just a frozen chunk of land in the North Atlantic.
Who follow their heart no matter what the critics say. We must always remember that we share one home
Greenland for over a century.
And one
back in the 1860s, America opened talks with Denmark to buy both Greenland and Iceland. And after World War II, in 1946, the U.S. offered Denmark $100 million, about $1 billion in today's money, to purchase Greenland.
To come.
Denmark declined, but that didn't stop America from keeping a close eye on the island. Why? Because Greenland is perfectly positioned in the North Atlantic, making it a military and strategic asset. During World War II, the U.S. occupied Greenland to prevent Nazi Germany from using it as a base. After the war, Greenland played a key role in America's Cold War defense strategy, hosting Thule Air Base, one of the U.S. military's most important early warning stations for detecting Russian missile launches. But Greenland isn't just about military defense. It's also a goldmine of natural resources. Beneath the island's icy surface lie vast deposits of rare earth minerals, which are crucial for modern technology, from smartphones to electric vehicles to military equipment. And as climate change melts the Arctic ice, new shipping routes are opening up, making Greenland a key player in global trade. Trump sees Greenland as a strategic investment, both militarily and economically. He's floated the idea of buying the island multiple times, and in 2019, he even posted a photoshopped image of a Trump hotel planted in a Greenlandic village. His message? Greenland could be transformed under American leadership. But his proposal was met with outrage and ridicule. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen called the idea absurd and made it clear that Greenland isn't for sale. But here's where things get interesting. Greenland might not be for sale, but it is moving toward independence. In the last election, pro-independence parties won about 80% of the vote, and Greenland's Prime Minister, Mute Borup Egede, has openly talked about breaking away from Denmark. If Greenland becomes independent, it will face economic challenges since it currently relies on $500 million annually from Denmark to fund its government. This could open the door for foreign influence. Trump might see an opportunity to offer economic support, or even military protection in exchange for closer ties to the US. But Trump isn't the only one interested in Greenland. Russia and China have been quietly expanding their presence in the Arctic, investing in infrastructure and research stations. In fact, China has declared itself a near-Arctic state, and Chinese companies have been buying stakes in mining operations on the island. Trump's push to buy Greenland is as much about keeping it out of China's hands as it is about securing it for America. Let's move to the Panama Canal, another key territory that Trump has suggested reclaiming. The canal is one of the most important trade routes in the world, connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. It was built by the U.S. in the early 20th century and controlled by America for decades. But in 1977, President Jimmy Carter signed a controversial treaty to return control of the canal to Panama by 1999. Many Republicans, including Ronald Reagan, opposed the treaty, arguing that the canal was too important to America's national security and economic interests to give up. Today, the Panama Canal handles 5% of global trade, and its tolls are a major source of revenue for Panama. Trump's comments about taking back control of the canal are rooted in his belief that America gave up too much when it handed the canal over. But there's another layer to this: China. In recent years, China has expanded its influence in Panama. Chinese companies now operate ports at both ends of the canal, and Panama has strengthened its diplomatic ties with Beijing. In 2017, Panama cut ties with Taiwan and formally recognized China, a move that alarmed U.S. officials. Trump has expressed concern about China's growing influence in Latin America, and his comments about the canal may be part of a broader strategy to push back against China's presence in the region. But could the U.S. realistically reclaim the canal? The answer is no, not without causing a major diplomatic crisis. The Panama Canal Treaty is a legally binding agreement, and violating it would severely damage U.S.-Latin America relations. It could even push Panama closer to China, which would be a strategic disaster for the U.S. However, Trump's bellicose rhetoric about the canal could still raise tensions and signal to Panama that the U.S. is watching closely. Finally, let's talk about Canada, perhaps Trump's most outlandish proposal of all. In December, Trump joked about annexing Canada, suggesting that it could become the 51st state of the U.S. While it might sound absurd, Trump has mentioned this idea multiple times on Truth Social, arguing that a U.S.-Canada merger would strengthen North American security and boost economic stability. But let's be real, there's no appetite for this in Canada. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has firmly rejected the idea, and the Canadian public is overwhelmingly against any suggestion of merging with the U.S. In fact, the only political party to ever support the idea is a fringe Quebec party called Party 51, which won just 0.02% of the vote in the 2022 Quebec election. The idea of annexing Canada is politically impossible, but it's worth noting that Trump's rhetoric reflects his broader belief in border fluidity. For Trump, borders aren't fixed or sacred. They're negotiable assets that can be redefined if it benefits America. His comments about Canada, Greenland, and the Panama Canal all point to a willingness to challenge long-standing diplomatic norms and reshape America's role in the world. Trump's proposals to expand U.S. borders haven't just raised eyebrows. They've triggered strong reactions from world leaders, diplomats, and policy experts. His comments have been dismissed by some as political theater, but others see them as a serious threat to international stability. So, how have Trump's allies and adversaries reacted to these territorial ambitions? And what could these proposals mean for global diplomacy? Let's start with Denmark and Greenland. When Trump first floated the idea of buying Greenland back in 2019, the response from Danish officials was swift and unequivocal. The Prime Minister of Denmark, Mette Frederiksen, called the idea absurd and said Greenland is not for sale. Her dismissal was so blunt that Trump responded by canceling a planned state visit to Denmark, calling Frederiksen's comments nasty and inappropriate. The diplomatic spat made headlines worldwide and strained relations between Washington and Copenhagen, two countries that are traditionally strong allies. But the tension didn't stop there. In recent months, Trump has doubled down on his interest in Greenland, posting multiple times on Truth Social about the island's strategic importance. He's even hinted at imposing economic pressure on Denmark if they don't come to the table. However, this aggressive stance risks alienating a key NATO ally. Denmark plays a vital role in Arctic defense and security cooperation, and pushing them too hard could backfire by pushing Greenland closer to independence. something the U.S. may not be prepared for. And that's exactly what's happening. In his New Year's address, Greenland's Prime Minister Mute Borup Egede reiterated his government's commitment to independence from Denmark. Pro-independence parties have been gaining ground in Greenland for years, and Trump's rhetoric may actually be accelerating that movement. But here's the twist. An independent Greenland would be financially vulnerable, as it currently relies on annual subsidies from Denmark. That opens the door for foreign powers, namely Russia and China, to step in with economic aid or investment deals. If that happens, the U.S. could end up losing influence in the Arctic rather than gaining it. And it's not just Denmark and Greenland that are reacting to Trump's proposals. Canada has also pushed back, hard. When Trump suggested that Canada could become the 51st state, it was widely seen as insulting and unrealistic. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau made it clear that Canada's sovereignty is non-negotiable. Trudeau said there is absolutely no interest in merging with the U.S., and public opinion in Canada overwhelmingly supports that stance. In fact, many Canadians view Trump's comments as a reminder of why Canada must maintain its independence from its southern neighbor. The Canadian public reaction has been equally strong. Trump's comments have sparked satirical memes, protests, and even a renewed sense of national pride. One Canadian newspaper ran the headline, "Sorry, Mr. Trump, we're not for sale," while another compared Trump's comments to colonial-era land grabs. The overall sentiment, Canada has no intention of becoming part of the U.S., no matter how much economic or security pressure is applied. But while Trump's proposals have been laughed off by many, they've raised alarms in diplomatic circles. Experts warn that reopening discussions about territorial expansion could destabilize global norms and encourage other countries to pursue their own territorial ambitions. Imagine what would happen if Russia or China
The future belongs to the people who follow their heart no matter what the critics say. We must always remember that we share one home and one glorious
If the U.S. starts normalizing
We all
the idea
bleed
of
the same
acquiring
red
territories,
blood
it could
of
set a
patriots.
dangerous precedent.
We all
For example,
salute
China
the
might feel
same
emboldened
great
to escalate its
American
claims over
flag.
Taiwan,
Our
using
best
the logic that
days
borders are negotiable
yet
if there's a
to come.
strategic benefit, or Russia could justify further expansion into Eastern Europe, claiming that it's simply protecting its interests. The risk here is that Trump's rhetoric could erode the principle of national sovereignty, which has been a cornerstone of international law since World War II. And let's not forget about Latin America, where Trump's comments about reclaiming the Panama Canal have also raised concerns. The Panamanian government has made it clear that they have no intention of giving up control of the canal, which has been under Panamanian management since 1999. But Trump's remarks have revived old fears about U.S. interventionism in the region. Historically, the U.S. has had a complicated relationship with Latin America, from military interventions to regime changes. Many countries in the region view American influence with skepticism and caution. Trump's talk of reclaiming the canal risks reopening old wounds and pushing Panama, and potentially other Latin American countries, closer to China. In fact, China has been expanding its influence in Latin America for years, investing in infrastructure projects, ports, and energy sectors. If Panama feels threatened by U.S. rhetoric, it could strengthen its ties with Beijing, further reducing U.S. influence in the region. Once again, Trump's comments may have the opposite effect of what he intended. So, where does this leave America on the global stage? Trump's proposals have certainly captured attention, but they've also alienated allies and raised concerns among diplomats. The world is watching closely, and many are wondering whether America's approach to diplomacy is shifting from stability and cooperation to unpredictability and coercion. But the question remains, how serious is Trump about these ideas? Are they just political stunts to rally his base, or is he laying the groundwork for actual policy moves? In the next section, we'll explore the potential consequences of Trump's territorial ambitions and whether he could realistically act on these proposals. Trump's expansionist ideas may sound like political theater to some, but the implications of his rhetoric are far from harmless. These proposals, whether serious or not, are already shifting the geopolitical landscape. They've strained diplomatic relationships, emboldened adversaries, and raised questions about America's future foreign policy direction. But what would happen if these ideas actually gain traction? Could we be looking at a world where borders are no longer fixed and territories are up for grabs once again? And what economic and political risks could arise if the U.S. truly attempted to redraw the map? Let's start with one of the biggest risks, the the potential for global instability. Since the end of World War II, the international order has been built around the idea of sovereignty and respect for borders. It's one of the core principles of international law, the belief that countries have the right to govern their own territories without interference from others. This principle has helped prevent large-scale wars and territorial conflicts for decades. But Trump's rhetoric is challenging that norm. When a former U.S. president openly talks about annexing other countries or territories, it sends a message to the rest of the world: borders are negotiable. And if the U.S. is willing to push the idea of territorial expansion, what's stopping other countries from doing the same? Imagine if Russia used Trump's rhetoric to justify further expansion into Eastern Europe, or if China ramped up its efforts to take control of Taiwan, arguing that borders are simply political agreements that can be revised when convenient. In fact, we've already seen Russia take this approach in Crimea. Back in 2014, Russia annexed Crimea from Ukraine, claiming it was protecting ethnic Russians in the region. The move was widely condemned by the international community, and it led to sanctions against Russia. But what if more countries start using this protective logic to justify territorial grabs? If Trump's proposals normalize the idea that sovereignty is flexible, we could be looking at a world where territorial conflicts become the norm, not the exception. And it's not just about military conflicts. There's a huge economic risk involved in reopening territorial disputes. Countries depend on stable borders to maintain trade routes, secure investments, and foster economic growth. If borders suddenly become fluid, it creates uncertainty in global markets. Businesses are far less likely to invest in regions that could become political hotspots overnight. Take Greenland, for example. If the U.S. were to seriously pursue acquiring Greenland, it could trigger a diplomatic crisis with Denmark and the European Union. Greenland is currently part of the Kingdom of Denmark, and the EU would likely view any attempt by the U.S. to purchase or annex the territory as a threat to European stability. This could lead to trade tensions, sanctions, and even military posturing from NATO allies. The result? Economic instability in both Europe and North America. And then there's the Panama Canal. Reclaiming the canal would require the U.S. to violate a legally binding treaty. The canal is a critical trade route, handling 5% of global trade, and any attempt to seize control would severely damage U.S.-Latin America relations. Countries in the region would likely view the U.S. as an aggressor, further pushing them toward China, which has been expanding its influence in Latin America for years. In fact, China stands to benefit the most if Trump's proposals were ever acted upon. If America's allies begin to see the U.S. as unpredictable and aggressive, they may turn to China for stability. China has been working to position itself as a reliable partner in global trade and infrastructure, offering investment deals through initiatives like the Belt and Road Project. If Trump's actions push countries like Panama or Greenland away from the U.S., China could fill the void, further expanding its global influence. But what about Canada? Could Trump really annex Canada? The short answer is no, at least not without severe political and economic consequences. The idea of Canada becoming the 51st state is widely rejected by Canadians, and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has made it clear that Canada's sovereignty is non-negotiable. But even floating the idea damages the relationship between two of the world's closest allies. Canada and the U.S. share one of the largest trade partnerships in the world, and disrupting that relationship could have huge economic consequences, not just for Canada, but for the U.S. as well. Beyond the economic risks, there's also the potential for domestic unrest. In all three cases, Greenland, Panama, and Canada, Trump's proposals would likely face strong resistance from the people living in those territories. Greenlanders have repeatedly said, "We are not for sale," and Panama has made it clear that they will not give up control of the canal. Attempting to annex or reclaim these territories could lead to protests, political instability, and even insurgency movements. So, what's the endgame? Could Trump actually act on these ideas? Based on his track record, it's not impossible. Trump has repeatedly turned bold ideas into reality, even when they seemed far-fetched at first. When he first promised to renegotiate NAFTA, critics said it couldn't be done. He did it. When he vowed to move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, many thought it would never happen. He did that too. Trump has shown that he's willing to defy norms and break diplomatic conventions if it serves his vision of America first. But acting on these territorial ambitions would be far riskier than any of Trump's previous moves. It could destabilize entire regions, spark international conflicts, and damage America's standing on the global stage. The world has moved past the era of territorial expansion, and any attempt to return to that mindset could have unpredictable and dangerous consequences. So the real question is, does Trump understand the risks? Or is this just another case of testing the waters to see how far he can push before the world pushes back? At this point, you might be wondering, is Trump serious about these proposals? Is the idea of buying Greenland, reclaiming the Panama Canal, or annexing Canada just another example of his attention-seeking rhetoric? Or is it something more? The truth is, with Trump, it's hard to know for sure. But if his track record tells us anything, it's that we shouldn't be too quick to dismiss his ideas as impossible or outlandish. Many of the things Trump proposed before taking office were initially laughed off by political experts and world leaders until he actually followed through. Take moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, for example. For decades, every U.S. president, Republican and Democrat alike, avoided doing it, despite campaign promises, because it was seen as too politically dangerous. But Trump did it. Or consider his decision to renegotiate NAFTA, a trade deal that most thought was set in stone. Again, Trump did it. And when he imposed tariffs on China, many thought it would lead to economic disaster. But Trump pushed forward, using economic leverage to reshape the relationship between the two countries. These moves show a clear pattern. Trump doesn't play by the traditional rules of diplomacy. He approaches global politics the same way he approached his real estate deals, starting with bold, extreme demands to get attention and leverage. And once he's at the negotiating table, he's willing to push boundaries to get what he wants. So, could Trump actually pursue territorial expansion? The answer is, it's not out of the question. Of all Trump's territorial ambitions, Greenland is the most plausible target. Why? Because there's already a historical precedent for the U.S. trying to buy Greenland. As we've discussed, the U.S. made a serious offer to purchase the island from Denmark in 1946, and the U.S. has maintained a strategic interest in Greenland ever since. The island's military value, natural resources, and position in the Arctic make it a highly desirable asset for any global power. But acquiring Greenland wouldn't be easy. Denmark has no intention of selling, and Greenland's government has made it clear that they're pursuing independence, not a merger with the U.S. The only way the U.S. could realistically gain control of Greenland would be through economic pressure or diplomatic negotiations. For example, the U.S. could offer massive financial aid to an independent Greenland in exchange for exclusive access to its resources or military bases. However, there's a major risk here. China and Russia are also interested in expanding their influence in the Arctic. If Trump's rhetoric pushes Greenland closer to independence, but the U.S. fails to secure a deal, China or Russia could step in with their own offers. This would put U.S. Arctic security at risk and further erode America's global influence. When it comes to reclaiming the Panama Canal, the situation gets even more complicated. The canal is one of the most important trade routes in the world, and Trump's suggestion that the U.S. should take it back reflects his America First mindset, a belief that strategic assets should be controlled by America, not foreign governments. But there's one huge problem: the Panama Canal Treaty. The U.S. signed a legally binding agreement to hand over control of the canal to Panama by 1999, and any attempt to violate that treaty would cause serious diplomatic fallout. Reclaiming the canal would also require military intervention or economic coercion, both of which could destabilize U.S.-Latin America relations. Countries in the region already view American interventionism with skepticism, and any aggressive moves by the U.S. could push Panama and other Latin American countries closer to China. In recent years, China has been investing heavily in Latin America, including ports and infrastructure projects in Panama. If the U.S. tries to take back the canal, it could create a power vacuum that China is more than willing to fill. The result? Increased Chinese influence in the Western Hemisphere, something that Trump claims to want to prevent. Then there's Canada, Trump's most outlandish proposal. The idea that Canada could become the 51st state of the United States has been widely dismissed as a joke. But Trump has mentioned it multiple times, arguing that a U.S.-Canada merger would improve security and economic stability. The reality is, there's no appetite for this in Canada. Canadians are fiercely proud of their sovereignty, and any suggestion of annexation would be politically toxic. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has already rejected the idea outright, and Canadian public opinion is overwhelmingly against any form of merger with the U.S. But what if economic pressure
The more
was
that
applied?
a broken system
Trump has shown
tells
that he's
you
willing to use
that
tariffs
you're
and trade
wrong,
deals to
the
get
more
what he
certain
wants.
you should
If
be
the U.S. imposed
that you
high
must
tariffs on
keep
Canadian goods,
pushing
it could hurt
ahead.
Canada's economy, potentially
Because
forcing
it's the
concessions.
outsiders who change
However,
the
this
world,
approach would likely cause
and it'll make a
irreparable
real
damage
and
to
lasting
US-Canada
difference.
relations. One of the
Nothing
strongest
worth
alliances
doing
in the world.
ever
In short,
came easy.
annexing Canada is highly
Treat the
unlikely.
word
But
impossible
Trump's comments reflect his
as
belief that
nothing
borders
more
are negotiable,
than
and that's a
motivation.
dangerous
The
precedent to
future
set.
belongs to
Even
the
if Trump
people
were serious
who
about
follow
pursuing
their heart
territorial
no matter
expansion,
what
he
the
would face
critics say.
significant legal
We
and
must
political
always
barriers.
remember
The U.S.
that we share
Constitution
one
doesn't
home
allow for unilateral
and one
annexation of foreign territories.
glorious
Any
destiny.
acquisition would
We
require
all
approval from
bleed the
Congress
same
and,
red
in
blood
some cases,
of
referendums
patriots.
in the affected territories.
We all salute
Additionally,
the same
international law
great
strictly
American
forbids the use
flag.
of force to
Our
acquire
best
territory.
days
Violating these
are
laws
yet
would severely
to come.
damage America's reputation and could even lead to sanctions from allies. But here's the thing. Trump has never been one to follow the rules. He's shown time and again that he's willing to challenge norms, ignore precedent, and push boundaries to achieve his goals. The real question is, would Trump be willing to risk America's global standing to make these ideas a reality? If Trump, or any future leader, were to seriously pursue territorial expansion, the consequences could be catastrophic. It would destabilize the global order, encourage other countries to pursue territorial ambitions, and spark conflicts in regions that are currently stable. Imagine a world where borders are constantly in flux, where countries no longer respect sovereignty, and where powerful nations feel entitled to expand their territory. That's the danger of Trump's rhetoric. It reopens a dangerous conversation that the world thought was settled after World War II. So, is it possible? Yes. Is it likely? Not without significant consequences. At the core of Trump's expansionist ideas is a vision of power and influence that goes beyond traditional diplomacy. His proposals to buy Greenland, reclaim the Panama Canal, and even annex Canada aren't just random off-the-cuff remarks. They're a reflection of how Trump sees the world, as a competitive, transactional arena where countries act like businesses, negotiating deals to secure resources, land, and strategic advantages. This mindset is central to Trump's America First philosophy. It's a belief that America's interests should always come first, even if that means challenging international norms or breaking long-standing diplomatic agreements. In Trump's world, global diplomacy isn't about cooperation or alliances based on shared values. It's about leverage, strength, and control. But this approach presents a dangerous risk. The post-World War II international order has been built on the principle of sovereignty, the idea that countries have the right to govern themselves without the threat of outside interference. This principle has prevented major conflicts and helped maintain global stability for decades. If territorial expansion suddenly becomes normalized, we could see a return to a more unstable, dangerous world. A world where borders are constantly being redrawn, where powerful nations feel entitled to seize land, and where conflicts over territory become the new normal. We've already seen echoes of this instability. In 2014, Russia annexed Crimea, claiming it was protecting ethnic Russians in the region. The move was condemned by the West, but it showed that territorial expansion isn't a relic of the past. It's still very much a part of modern geopolitics. And with China's growing ambitions in Taiwan and the South China Sea, it's clear that borders are once again becoming contested in ways that many thought were behind us. Trump's rhetoric only adds fuel to this fire. By reopening conversations about territorial expansion, he risks legitimizing similar actions by other countries. If America, a supposed defender of sovereignty and democracy, starts talking about buying land or annexing territories, what message does that send to authoritarian regimes? It tells them that borders are negotiable. It tells them that might makes right. The implications for U.S. foreign policy are profound. For decades, America has been seen as a global leader, promoting stability, democracy, and human rights. But Trump's proposal suggests a shift toward a more transactional, power-driven approach. It's a vision of America as a dominant force, willing to reshape the world map to suit its own interests. So, what's next? Could these ideas actually gain traction in the future? That depends on who holds power in Washington. Trump's proposals may seem extreme now, but as we've seen, ideas that start on the fringes can quickly move into the mainstream. If global tensions continue to rise, and if competition for resources and strategic territories intensifies, the idea of territorial expansion could become more appealing to future leaders, especially in a world where nationalism and protectionism are on the rise. The key question is whether America's allies and rivals will continue to respect the principle of sovereignty, or whether they'll follow Trump's lead in redefining borders. The risk is that other countries, like Russia and China, may see Trump's rhetoric as a green light to pursue their own territorial ambitions, triggering a new era of geopolitical instability. But there's one more question to consider. What about the American people? How would they react to a leader who actively pursues territorial expansion? Historically, Americans have been deeply wary of imperialism. After all, the country was founded on the idea of breaking free from colonial rule. Yet, in recent years, there's been a growing appetite for strong, nationalist leadership. Leaders who promise to make America great again by putting American interests first, no matter the cost. So, could Trump, or someone like him, convince the American public that expanding U.S. borders is the right move? That depends on how the narrative is framed. If it's presented as a way to secure American jobs, protect national security, or counter foreign threats, it's possible that some Americans might support it. After all, Trump's base has already embraced many of his unconventional ideas, even when they've challenged traditional norms. The truth is, we're entering uncharted territory. Trump's proposals are pushing the boundaries of modern diplomacy, and the global reactions we've seen so far are just the beginning. Whether or not these ideas ever become policy, they have already had a profound impact on how the world sees America. The U.S. is no longer seen as a predictable
The more
ally
that a broken
plays by the
system
rules.
tells you
It's now seen
that
as a
you're
wild
wrong,
card,
the more
capable
certain
of
you
radical
should
shifts in
be
foreign policy
that you
direction.
must keep
So, what does the
pushing
future
ahead.
hold? Could America's borders
Because
really
it's the
change in
outsiders who
21st
change the
century?
world,
And if so,
and who make a
what would
real
the
and
consequences
lasting
be for
difference.
global stability?
Nothing
These are the
worth
questions that
doing
world leaders
ever
and diplomats are
came
grappling
easy.
with right now.
Treat
Because
the
whether we
word
like it or
impossible
not, Trump's rhetoric has
as
changed the
nothing
conversation.
more
He's
than
reopened the
motivation.
door to territorial
The future
expansion,
belongs to
and
the
now
people
the world is left
who
wondering
follow their heart
who's
no
next
matter
to walk
what
through it.
the critics
In the
say.
end, the question
We
isn't
must
just about
always
Trump.
remember
It's about what
that
kind
we
of
share
world
one
we want
home
to live in. Do we want
and
to
one
maintain a system where
glorious
sovereignty is respected,
destiny.
where
We
borders
all
remain
bleed
stable,
the same
and where
red
countries work
blood
together to
of
solve
patriots.
global challenges?
We all
Or are we
salute
heading toward a world
the same
where territory
great
is up for
American
grabs,
flag.
where the strong
Our
take from the
best
weak, and
days
national power
are
is
yet
prioritized
to
over
come.
international cooperation? These are the stakes. And as we move forward into an uncertain geopolitical future, the choices made by leaders and citizens alike will determine whether we continue down the path of stability and cooperation, or whether we revert to the dangerous, chaotic world of territorial ambitions. So, what do you think? Are Trump's proposals just empty rhetoric, or do you think there's a real possibility that future leaders might act on these ideas? What would the world look like if borders were no longer fixed, and territory could be bought, sold, or annexed at will? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.